Hello and welcome back to the 14th annual Summer Symposium for the Paleontological Research Institute. Due to the developments across our country and around the world, we as a group of Cornell graduate students and early career professionals felt that we should dedicate our symposium this year to diversity, equity, and inclusion in paleontology. I am pleased to welcome all of our speakers, and we hope that the presentations and the Q&A panels will foster meaningful conversations and invoke change in our field. So today, Dana Friend will be our moderator for this session, and I'll pass it off to Dana.
Thank you so much, Matthew. Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to session 2 of today's program. As Matthew said, I'm Dana Friend, and I'm going to be the moderator for this session. And there are also several people helping behind the scenes to be moderator for chat and the Q&A and handle technical things. Now, this session will be recorded for viewing later, except for our final speaker who has requested that her presentation not be filmed. So please also be aware of not taking pictures or, screen capping or anything like that for yourself. We want to honor those speakers' wishes. So thank you for joining us, and thank you to all the speakers in advance. So how this is going to go is that each presenter will present for 20 minutes and then followed by about 5 minutes for audience questions. So please direct your speaker questions to the Q&A chat feature found at the bottom of your screen. And if you have a specific question for a specific panelist, please indicate that panelist in your question. These will be asked of the presenters by one of the moderators. And the chat function has been made available for technical questions or conversing with other attendees. Please use this judiciously, as any malicious or inappropriate use of the chat may result in your removal from the session, and we don't want to do that. Please see our code of conduct on the symposium webpage for more information if you have questions. And please bear with us as we navigate this virtual format and any technical difficulties we may have. And if Zoom crashes for some reason, just please rejoin the webinar with your registration link and we will resume as soon as possible. So now I would like to begin by presenting our very first speaker for session 2. Please welcome Dr. Phil Stokes. Phil, please take it away.
All right, thank you so much, Dana. Thank you to PRI for inviting me to talk a little bit about an issue that I think is very important, and it's also very timely in our country. And I'm really pleased to be able to share with you some of my dissertation research, as well as some thoughts on what we can do in our academic lives or in our professional lives or when we're working with the public to really foster inclusion. So on that note, I will get started here. And so I'm going to talk about my PhD research from University of Arizona, which was a series of manuscripts, which for my research I interviewed a whole bunch of undergraduate geology majors at several universities to get an idea of what their experiences were like in the geosciences major. So one thing to keep in mind, I'm just going to tell you a little bit about the study background, but really, I'm going to leave out a lot of the methods and statistical analyses, just so we can talk about sort of the results and what the implications are. And then, hopefully, if you're interested in learning more about the methodology, you'll do so. And I think probably everyone who's watching this presentation is at least aware that the geosciences are among the least diverse, or maybe they still are, the least diverse of all the STEM fields. So I looked at socio-cultural factors and how they influence choice of major. This advertisement here was something that I saw in a magazine somewhere, and I thought it would be a perfect sort of Oh, hang on a second. We've got some low audio here. Let's see. Just pause for a moment and see if I can increase the volume. Microphone. Let's try that one. How's the audio now? Okay, it appears that Zoom automatically switched from the microphone on my headset to a different microphone. Oh dear. Okay, so, all right. So back to my presentation, and hopefully we we don't have that issue. So I looked at social cultural factors, this idea that, you know, sort of things we see around us, including friends and family influences, really affect choice of major. And so this ad really captured, you know, the thought, you know, what will my friends think if I transfer? You know, so what will someone's friends think if they become a geologist, you know, was one of my interview questions. So I used this technique called the critical incident technique, and it was developed by this guy named John Flanagan. It was developed during World War II to identify affected behaviors and predict the likelihood for success of pilot trainees. This is back when the Air Force was part of the Army, and the US government was spending a ton of money on recruiting and training pilots, and there were a lot of washouts. And so John Flanagan developed an interview protocol, basically a series of questions to determine if someone was likely to continue as a pilot or if they would maybe not make it. And what was really neat about his technique is that it's still used today. So if you've ever been interviewed for a job and someone asks you what you would do in a certain type of situation, you know, they're really looking for a pattern of behaviors that can tell something about, you know, who you are and the chances that you'll do well in that position. So John Flanagan defined a critical incident as an experience which affected a person's beliefs, values, or behaviors. So for my research, I narrowed it down so that a critical incident was a reported experience which influenced choice of major. And the major was the geology major, of course. So I interviewed a lot of students, and I'll just give you an idea of what some of the interview questions you know, were like and the responses. So I would ask a student, you know, tell me about, you know, experiences you had while you were growing up that might have influenced your choice of major. So it's pretty straightforward. And here's an example of a critical incident that a student from, I believe it was from Montana, told me. So he says, it was a warm summer day and there were active tornado warnings in the county where I grew up. My grandpa took me out and we saw a tornado. So that is the experience part of the critical incident. And then he also said, it was awesome. That's how I first got interested in science. So that's the outcome. So once I collected critical incidents, I then filtered them into different categories and subcategories. And this is based on a taxonomic system. So if you're familiar with paleontology, you probably know taxonomy. It's just a classification system. And then the outcome was sorted based on whether the incident would have a positive effect on choice of major or a negative effect. And I gotta say, so my research was sponsored by this company called QSR International. I believe they're based out of Australia. And they had a program called In Vivo. And so QSR actually sponsored my research. So I was really grateful. It was a really helpful platform. What was funny though, is I learned while I was using the software that they were previously called Nudist. So, you know, maybe it was a wise decision to change it if you're gonna be in social and behavioral science. So I collected critical incidents from 39 current and former geoscience majors from 2 institutions, 21 of whom were white, 9 were Hispanic or Latino. And I should admit these numbers, if they don't add up, it's because there's a third sample of African-American students that I'm not including in the presentation today. So these numbers won't add up to 39. But for the sake of brevity, I left that group out. And then 22 were female, 17 were male. Interviews were 45 minutes long, and they followed an approved human subjects protocol. If you've ever gone through that process, it's pretty interesting. So we identified a total of 1,169 critical incidents, or about 30 per student. Now, I have to add there are a whole bunch of limitations on the study, and primarily the external validity, which basically means how much of this data we can apply to other places, is limited by the fact that it's a small sample. So here's what it looks like. And I'll just leave this up for a second or two. So basically, all of the students' experiences that were reported, I sorted into several types of factors. So out of school factors, which were critical incidents that occurred while a student was growing up. So basically before school or out of school. K-12, which, as you could imagine, it was in primary school, middle school, and high school. And college factors, so critical incidents which occurred while the student was in college. And this was based on a previous study, which was a little more exploratory, but kind of laid the groundwork. So you could see there's quite a few categories, subcategories, and even some subcategories. The idea here is to try to divide these things so then you can do a statistical analysis. And I did using ANOVA, and I also did a pairwise comparison across each category. So for those of you who are really into geeking out and taxonomies, there were no subcategories, but I probably could have done that too, and my advisor would not have liked it. So give you a few examples of some of these incidents. So one example of a course experience from college. So the student told me, I never really considered becoming a geology major until about halfway through my geology course. The professor approached me and asked if I had ever considered it. So the student then told me it was pretty much right at that moment that I decided to switch. Another example of a critical incident is something called a personal characteristic. And this is basically, as it implies, something that the individual might affect them personally or be a result of one of their personal characteristics. And this happened to be a female student. She was telling me the story. And she said, I know that there's a big difference between the numbers of men versus women in the science field. I thought it was cool that the first two people that I met in the geoscience department were women. So if you can imagine, so that first part is the experience, the second part is the outcome. So in the first manuscript I'm going to talk about, which was in GSA Today in 2014, focused mainly on the differences, reported differences between Hispanic and white students. And it only included a small number of findings because this was a relatively preliminary study. So up at the top, you'll see those three categories, the college factors, the K-12, and the out of school. So in out of school factors, I collected 127 incidents over 5 subcategories. And I'll just talk a little bit about those. So in this plot, you can see here on the x-axis, those are the categories, so family factors, outdoor experiences, etc. On the y-axis, you can see the average number of incidents per student. And then on the left, there's two bars. The left bar, which is yellow, that is for white students, and the right bar, which is like a light blue, is for students who identified as Hispanic or Latino. So you can see these numbers were fairly similar with one exception for outdoor experiences. And this was a significant finding, which just means that chances are it's not due to randomness. And so this type of example, right, an outdoor experience while growing up would fall under that category of the earlier incident that I shared, where the student was telling me about his grandpa taking him to go check out tornadoes. And so as you'll see, in this example, the white students reported about 3 times as many outdoor experiences while growing up as Hispanic and Latino students. Now, if we look at K-12 factors, there were 105 incidents over 10 subcategories, but no statistically significant differences. Then looking at college factors, that's where most of the incidents were. There were 649 over 14 subcategories. And I'm just going to show you the top 9 because it's a PowerPoint presentation and we're all supposed to keep the data limited on slides. So here's that graph. On the x-axis, you can see the categories, so course experiences, family factors. These are ranked by most incidents to least incidents, or should say most incidents to fewest incidents. And then on the y-axis, you can see the average number of incidents per students again. So the bar on the left, the yellow, is for white students, and the bar on the right is for Hispanic and Latino students. And really, the numbers are pretty similar, with one big thing to note here, and that is family factors. And so this type of incident was actually really common for all the students in the sample. Basically everyone has stories about how their family reacted when they decided to declare a geology major. And so this is one Hispanic student told me this story. She said, I haven't yet told my family that I'm thinking of moving out of state when I finish my degree. They have that guilty conscience thing where they think you're trying to move away from the family. So this type of incident, as you could see, Hispanic students reported about twice as many family factors while in college. So I said, okay, this is really interesting. Let's break this down a little further. So if we look at all college factors for positive and negative outcomes, you'll see that, and maybe not surprisingly, geology majors have a lot more positive experiences relating to choice of major than negative, right? If you had too many negative majors, you probably wouldn't be in the major. You can see, though, that the positive outcomes are roughly equal. They're pretty close, but negative outcomes, there's quite a difference. And in fact, the Hispanic or Latino students, which are shown in the light blue bar, averaged far more than white students when it comes to negative outcomes. And so this was another significant difference. However, when we take away family factors, the significant difference disappears. So really, my thought is this difference was actually driving the change that you see here from positive and negative. Oh, there it is. So just to summarize the results here. So Hispanic and Latino students reported far fewer out-of-school outdoor experiences than white students. Hispanic and Latino students reported far more college family factors than white students, and these were strongly negative. Now, the second manuscript I'll talk about was much longer in length, and it featured some full discussions about the data and the categories and everything. So if you're really into this sort of thing, I'd check it out. Oops, we jumped ahead here. And so if you're really, if you're into it, I'm happy to share. And so just gonna share with you kind of how it was ranked here. So this, this somewhat busy chart will show you all of the major categories for college factors. And again, this time they're ranked a little bit differently. On the far left, you can see where it says career and economics, 98%. That means that 98% of the incidents that were reported were positive. Right, so these were influences that strongly supported a student's choice to major in geology. Far on the right, where the bar says 20% experiences with other majors, these are strongly negative incidents. So students who reported experiences that really undermined their choice of major. And so you could see it kind of in the middle of the chart here, sort of the most popular incidents, things where people were, pretty much everyone reported was course experiences, family factors, and personal characteristics. And so that might be someone who said, you know, I really like studying the earth, you know, because I'm an outdoorsy person or something. So we did another statistical analysis, kind of similar to the first manuscript, but this time we did it by gender. So college factors, we had a very large number of incidents, and it was sorted into 15 subcategories. And there were two differences that I'll point out here. In K-12, there were far fewer incidents to report, and there was one difference, but I'm not going to talk about it here for the sake of time. And then in out-of-school factors, there was a similarly small number of incidents and no statistical differences. So really, I'm just going to focus on those college factors. And you can see in this chart, so this is the percentage of respondents reporting. So instead of number of incidents per person, this is now percentage of respondents reporting on the y-axis. And then on the x-axis, we have some of the same categories that you've seen before. The bar on the left, which is orange, signifies the male students, and the bar on the right, which is green, signifies the female students. So you can see for family factors and personal characteristics, course experiences, the numbers were really, really similar and there were no significant findings. But if we look at the right, at the economic factors, those were reported strongly more so by male students by quite a large margin. And then strangely, the experiences in non-geosciences courses were largely reported by women relative to men. So if you want to know what a course is, non-geoscience course, these were the classes that are required for the major, such as physics or chemistry or biology, that were, part of the degree plan. They're not, your general education classes. And they tended to be, negative experiences. So if we look at the economic factors more closely, nearly all were positive. And so an example is a guy told me, when I chose the major, I felt like I had a future. I know that with a lot of the other majors, you don't get a job afterwards. He said that he felt like geology would be different. And as I mentioned, required courses, much like my own experience, they were not that great. I was not a fan of calculus 2. And so this student also told me, so she said, I enjoy math, but I'm not very good at it. And she had considered switching from geology, ironically, right, into hydrology or atmospheric science because she couldn't hack the math. We kind of know now that those fields are probably more math intensive than geology, but really this type of incident was pretty common. About half the women reported something like that. So to summarize, men were far more likely than women to report positive economic factors as supporting of their choice of major. And women were far more likely than men to report negative experiences in non-geology courses. So what does it mean? So there's a couple ways to look at it. So my thought was, to better recruit underrepresented students, we should highlight geosciences careers and make that information available to the families of majors. I think, this is something I've been doing for a long time. Provide kids with more outdoor experiences and exposure to science. And then, women, based on the study, weren't choosing the geology major for economic factors. And so maybe we should reconsider how the major might be marketed to boost recruitment and retention. Now, there's one thing I'll add to the first point, if we're talking about careers and everything, maybe the best way to do it is, adjust the messaging to the audience. One thing I found working with kids from, across, the suburbs and rural areas and cities is kids growing up in the city tend to not have the same, awareness of nature. And, in particular, like they maybe have not even, seen rocks before, they don't know what's under the pavement. But they are concerned about environmental issues such as air and water quality. And so that might be something to highlight when you're, mentioning these careers. And lastly, women had reported different course experiences in those non-major required classes. My thought is they may be weeding out more women than men from the major. So I promised you some other stuff to think about. And this really is sort of my hopeful look on everything. So, you know, I've worked in universities and, you know, found it sometimes an uphill battle to get things done and make changes and everything. And, you know, more so nowadays, we're very fortunate that, you know, diversity is something that at least they're talking about and maybe hiring some folks to work on. But what happens if you don't have the means, you know, to share career information with parents? You don't have a budget for outreach. You're not getting any help to market your major, or you have limited means to advise students. And, you know, what if you want to help, you know, solve this issue, but you just simply, you know, right, lack the support from the administration or the time or really anything? Like, what is the most basic thing you can do? And I'll share with you this paper, which I've found a little depressing, but also encouraging at the same time. So this came out a few years ago from Physics Education Research. And the author, Zara Hazari, and her team looked at the factors that affected the physical science career interest of female students. And they tested several common hypotheses, which you see in the literature, right? There's so many thoughts about why, you know, there's all these diversity issues, you know, anything from implicit biases to discrimination, to some of the things that I've talked about. And so the authors looked at these 5 hypotheses that you could see in this graph, which I took from the paper. And they basically, it was sort of an intervention in their class. So they collected data on the students' interest in a science career, and then did like a before and after comparison to see how each of these interventions would affect that interest level. And so they looked at, you know, how a single sex class would have an effect, having women as guest speakers, having a female physics teacher, noting the work of women scientists. You know, if you've ever picked up a geology textbook, you'll know that they're pretty devoid of minority and female scientists. And then having a discussion about underrepresentation in science. And so I first read this paper, and my thought was, you know, this sucks, right? So many of these interventions that we think could have an effect on career interests really didn't seem to be doing much. You know, at least in this study, there was no measurable effect for a lot of these things, which we thought would be helpful. But what was encouraging is that simply having a discussion about the underrepresentation of women in physical science boosted the career interest of the students in the class. And so the authors wrote, and I really like how they put it, female students who were exposed to such discussions were significantly more likely to choose a physical science career than those who were not. So, you know, let this give you hope. You know, if you can't do all these, you know, outreach things and talk to parents and everything, you know, simply having this discussion with your students, with your colleagues, I believe will make a difference. So with that, I'd like to acknowledge University of Arizona, National Science Foundation, Opportunities for Enhancing Diversity in the Geosciences, USGS, and the Geological Society of America, and of course, QSR International, formerly Nudist. Well, thank you.
Thank you so much, Phil. Appreciate it. All right, so we have a couple of questions here, and I'm going to start you off by reading the first one. This is from Madeline Marshall. She says, Phil, could you talk about any thoughts on how the negative familial incidents for Hispanic Latinx students could be addressed to bring more positive outcomes, or how those students handled the negative pressure from family?
So that is a great question. You know, and there's definitely a bias here in the research, and that's that all the students I interviewed were either current or former majors. So there were some, presumably, who maybe were thinking about geology, but were talked out of the major by family members. You know, because if you know, and this is what some of the students reported. So they maybe were the first generation to go to college. And so their families really wanted them to have a visible career, like a doctor or an engineer, you know, or an attorney. And so geology just wasn't on the radar of the people who were, you know, helping to pay for college. My thought would be, in addition to having, that career information available, have a support group for your students who may have challenges, explaining what they do to their family members. I was really fortunate that we had an NSF grant to have students working in a lab, and they were students from underserved audiences. And so they could talk with each other about these problems, and you really, demonstrate to their parents what they were doing, whether it be in a research lab or community outreach, just to show that the degree had value and it was going to get them somewhere.
Thank you.
Hi, so we have another question. One of them was asked about how the students for your study were recruited.
Yeah, so they were, ideally you want a random sample, but basically it was a convenience sample. I was working at 2 different research universities in urban areas, and I just sent out an email and said, hey, if you want to be in the study, we'll give you a gift card. You just have to, do the interview, basically, took the students that way.
Great, thank you.
Sure.
All right, question from Ming. A lot of great information about increasing and welcoming US-based students in a US college setting. Any thoughts on how international students to the US or other countries, or in their own home countries, can be encouraged into earth sciences? Specifically thinking about how families of these students who may have no idea at all can be reached.
That's a great question, actually. So one of my previous life, I was an academic advisor, and I worked a lot with international students, and the ones we had were all from countries where either a government or a business or a family member was sponsoring them to come to the US to learn geology. And the plan was for them to then go back to their own countries to, become like oil folks or work in environmental consulting or something. So the draw of coming to the US was that, we had these quality programs with learning experiences like field camp, that were maybe not available where they come from. So I would say that, maybe highlighting, the strengths of the degree program at your university, and how that information can be applied to solving, society's challenges, would be a good starting point.
Thank you so much, Phil. All right, now we're gonna stop the questions for now because it's almost time for our next presentation. So coming up next will be Dr. Phoebe Cohen. All right, welcome back. Our next speaker, as I said, is going to be Dr. Phoebe Cohen. Phoebe, please take it away.
All right. Hi, everybody. My name is Phoebe Cohen. I'm a professor at Williams College, and today I'm going to be talking about a gender analysis of the Paleontological Society that I've been working on over the last few years. So first, I'd like to acknowledge all the people who have helped me immensely with this project. Some folks from the Paleo Society, Alicia Stegall, Dina Smith, Caroline Stromberg, and Robin Dahl. And then colleagues of mine at Williams College, Greg Mitchell in Women, Gender, and Sexuality Studies, and Chad Topaz in Math, as well as my colleague Robin Kodner. And I'd also like to acknowledge the feedback of some really amazing geoscientists and astronomers on Twitter whose handles are down here, who have also helped me develop some of the ideas in this talk. So first, I'd like to just start off by telling you a little bit about myself so you have an understanding of where I'm coming from. I'm a tenured faculty member at a small liberal arts college in Massachusetts. I'm white, I'm Jewish, I'm a US citizen, I'm a cisgendered heterosexual woman, and I'm a parent of a 3-year-old. In terms of my research, I'm a Proterozoic and Paleozoic micropaleontologist and geobiologist. And I'm a member of the Paleontological Council currently, and also of the PS Ethics Committee, and I've been involved in the Paleo Society ever since I was a student, so I was a student rep in grad school. So what's the Paleo Society? For those of you who aren't familiar, It's an international nonprofit organization devoted exclusively to the advancement of the science of paleontology. We are international, however, for the most part, our membership is very much US based, as well as Europe and the UK. So technically we're international, but you know. And the Paleo Society has its annual meeting at the Geological Society of America meeting every year. And so that's some of the information that I'm talking about relates to that. Okay, so first I'm just going to give a brief outline of some language that I'll be using around equity, inclusion, and gender, and then talk about the problem. So what is gender? Although this is just a quote from a research paper that discusses some of the ideas of gender and gender studies. Although gender has historically been treated as a stable binary category, it is more accurately understood as an evolving, socially constructed category of the human experience, and measurement methodologies need to respond appropriately. So here's a little cartoon, which some of you may have seen, the genderbread person. So this just outlines the different ways that we can think about someone's gender identity, expression, their biological sex, and their sexual orientation. So today I'm going to be talking about gender identity. And so those would be words like woman and man. And then there are many people who don't consider themselves either of those categories and may consider themselves genderqueer or use a different term. Another thing that I'll be talking about today is intersectionality, which was a term introduced by the scholar Kimberly Williams Crenshaw in 1989. And she came up with this idea to describe the unique challenges that Black women faced due to their intersecting identities of gender and race, specifically in the judicial system, criminal system. But it has since been expanded by Crenshaw and others to really talk about the unique challenges faced by those with multiple minoritized identities. So that could be things like gender or race, ethnicity, disability, etc., sexuality. Okay, so why do we need to count gender? For the women in the audience, you probably have some thoughts, some feelings about gender and paleontology already. So I don't think we need to count to know that there are problems, but counting can help us understand how things are changing or how things are not changing. So I'm going to talk briefly about personal experiences of myself and others, but there's also a lot of qualitative and quantitative data on the representation of women in the earth sciences, high rates of harassment and gender bias. And so I've just copied and pasted a few relevant papers over here on the right that discuss some of these issues. And I'll show a little bit of data from some of these later. So counting can help us know if things are changing, and when do we know if we're quote unquote done, although this work is never done. It can also help us figure out how the Paleontological Society may be sort of recapitulating gender roles in ways that wouldn't necessarily be immediately obvious. Okay, so just a little bit more background. The Paleo Society gives a number of awards every year at the annual meeting. I'll be talking about two of those awards today. The Stuckert Award, which is sort of the Young Scientist Award, which until 2016 was only awarded to members under the age of 40. But from 2017 onward, eligibility is now for those 15 years post-PhD conferral. And so right there is an example of something that the Paleo Society has done to try to make this award more equitable. And then there's the Paleontological Society Medal, which is sort of the, you can think of that as like the career achievement award. Okay, so this was the most recent PS banquet program I could find online. This is from 2015. So I joined the Paleo Society in 2002 when I was working for PRI as Warren Ullman's assistant. So I have a long history with PRI. So I've just highlighted the women who have received the Stuckert Award here. And I've also pointed out where I got my PhD. Okay, so I sat at this banquet for 10 years. When I got my PhD, the last woman to get the Stuckert Award got it my senior year of high school. So I sat at this banquet and I watched these men, many of whom I knew and respected, get up there and win that award. And it wasn't until 2013 that I saw a woman get up and win the Stuckert Award. Okay, so what about the Paleo Society Medal? All right, so here are the folks who have, the women who have won the PS medal. This is up until 2014. Many women have won it since then. So when I got my PhD, the last woman to get the PS medal was when I was in diapers. And she won it with a man. Okay, it's Helen Tappan. close and near to my heart as a paleontologist. So this was my personal experience and personal context going into this study. And of course, that personal experience is just one tiny drop. There's obviously a lot more actual research, but I just want to give you a context for my own personal motivation for doing this work. Okay, so a little bit more of an outline of potential problems here. So this was a recently published analysis of how the COVID-19 crisis has disproportionately impacted women versus men in terms of publications. So this is looking at the Earth Science preprint here. And so in the orange here, you're seeing submissions from March to April, and this is female first author, okay? So we're seeing a huge drop in women first authored papers on this preprint, okay? And this is likely due to increased childcare duties. I'm very familiar with that. Here's a picture from the Clancy et al. 2014 paper on harassment in field sites, which is, if you have not read this paper, is a must read, as well as the follow-up by Nelson, which is more of a qualitative approach. So the frequency of inappropriate comments at field sites heard by men and women. So, you know, many women regularly or frequently heard inappropriate comments in field work. And then this is a paper that was done by some folks looking at AGU data, Posselt et al. 2019, does gender imbalance affect you at scientific meetings? And, you know, about 17% of women said yes, 41% said to some extent. Okay. So what do the numbers say for our field at large? So this is data from NSF, which you can go onto the website that I've linked to at the bottom here, and you can make these graphs yourself. So this is looking at all earth science PhDs since 1980. So awesome, okay? In 1980, things were abysmal, and they're a lot better now, okay? Looks good. So we've reached, in some years, almost gender parity in terms of the number of PhDs. This is across, so this includes ocean and atmospheric sciences, okay? They don't have enough granular data. But if we look at who is actually a faculty member, and this is data from AGI, we see that things are still not so hot. Okay, so in 2016, so 4 years ago, only 15% of full professors were women, and not quite 25% of associate professors. So there's still this big disconnect between what we're seeing at the level of undergraduate or graduate education and what we're seeing in terms of faculty ranks. All right, so what about intersectionality? So far, everything I've talked about has just been plain gender, but we know that that is not the whole story. So here's a figure from the Bernard and Cooper doc, Nature Geoscience paper, No Progress on Diversity in 40 Years, which I think is a damning must read for our entire field. So this is looking at that same data set that I was just talking about, looking at race and ethnicity. So this is subfields combined. Okay, so the black line are white non-Hispanics, and the colored lines are other ethnic racial groups, and you can't even really tell where they are because they're all so low. So we can pull that out, and again, taking sort of an intersectional lens, break it out by the male and female. This is how the NSF reports the data as male and female. So if we look at Hispanic or Latino earth science PhDs, I thought this was kind of interesting. So starting around maybe 2000, you could squint and argue that men and women were getting their PhDs at equivalent numbers, extremely low numbers. If you look at Black or African American, you could potentially argue that African American Black women are receiving their PhDs slightly lower rates, but the numbers are so incredibly low that I think I would be remiss in actually doing any real statistical analysis on that. And then there's some good data from the AGU where they looked at posters versus talks at their large meeting. And I just highlighted the light bar are URM women. And essentially what this paper showed was that UR women comprise the group that is least likely to be invited or assigned to give a talk and are overrepresented in requesting to present posters, okay? So this is, again, looking at the intersection of gender and race and ethnicity in the earth sciences at large. Okay, and then of course we can listen to what people actually say about their own experiences. So this is from Stephanie Suarez, who's a geochronology grad student. I started this account to talk about my geology work, then realized it's impossible to do that without talking about racism because they're so entwined. Okay, and she's referring to the Cooper doc and Barnard paper here. All right. Then of course there's intersectionality with the LGBTQIA community. So here's just a couple quotes from folks on Twitter to just demonstrate this. So these are two British geologists who are basically pointing out the fact that you can, in many cases, there are countries where LGBTQIA students or faculty would not feel comfortable going on a geology field trip, like Oman. And so Imperial actually just got rid of their requirement for an Oman-based field trip because it is unsafe. Here's a recent article by PICRAIL where Riley Black discusses her experiences as a paleontologist doing field work. And I just highlighted one quote: "Given that many field camps are dominated by men, it is very easy for trans people to feel isolated, misgendered, and unsafe." And then Sam Giles, again, pointing out the intersection of gender and sexuality in terms of not having any queer role models. All right, I gotta hustle here because I spent so much time with background. Methods. So what did I do? I took lists of first name member lists from the Paleo Society. This record is very spotty. We have no records from the 1990s, and I was able to get a list from the archives from the mid-1980s. They couldn't determine the actual year, so I do have one data point from the 80s, but otherwise I have data starting in the early 2000s. I use the API genderize.io, which determines the likely gender of a given name. All unassigned names and names with low probabilities as assigned by the API were checked via personal websites, email signatures, social media profiles, personal information to assign a likely gender, and about 1% per year of names were unassigned. For committees and awards, a combination of these techniques were used. Starting in 2017, Paleo Society began collecting self-reporting data, which is really what you want, but response rates are low, and I'll get to that in a minute. Okay, so what are the limitations of the project? Until 2017, it ignored all gender identities outside of the binary. Bad. Okay. Includes non-self-reporting data. Also not good. It's not intersectional. So I've just spent all this time talking about intersectionality. It doesn't account for those things. And the API does really badly with non-Western names. So I did do an analysis of PS Journal authors, but it's incomplete because I'm going to have to spend a lot more time assigning names to likely genders. If you want to learn more about gender self-reporting, this article here, it's a preprint by a bunch of folks from the astronomy communities. I highly recommend it. Okay, so what did we find? This is the data that I have. We see an overrepresentation of members inferred to be men at all career stages, but the trends are good. So what do the colors mean? Blue are students. The sort of greenish are regular members. Green are retired members. The pink or amateur and avocational, that's a category that we've just introduced, so there's not much data there. And then the sort of purpley pink is our total data. So you can see I have one data point from back in the 80s, and then we don't really have any data, unfortunately, until we get to the early 2000s. Here I've just zoomed in to the last 20 years. And so if we look at the total, it's in the low 30s, okay? But our students are more like in the mid 40s or high 40s. So we do have some self-reporting data, and I've just asked that this not be copied or shared at this time. And so the triangles are self-reporting data. The blue triangles are 30 to 40% response rates, and the green triangle is our most recent data, which shows an 84% response rate, and I'll explain why that's so much higher. So you can see that the green triangle lines up quite nicely with the sort of trajectory of the pink, which I think is really nice. So moving forward, we will have self-reporting data. We will not have to rely on these likely gender assignments. Okay, because we have self-reporting data, we are also able to capture those who do not consider themselves to be female or male. So these are categories that are within the membership renewal. So you can see that I've just put in the response rates down here. So with self-reporting, we are able to capture basically the gender identity of that a person identifies with, and we don't have to make any inferences. So that's really important, and moving forward, that'll give us a chance to accurately capture our community. So what does this tell us, and is it useful? So one thing I think is of note is that student trends have been consistently higher than regular members for at least a decade and probably longer. And so there's this sort of trickle up. It works, but it's slow. Why is it slow? Why are we not seeing a faster shift from higher proportions of our student members being women to moving that into our total and our regular members, which are still quite low? So of course the total includes the students. So the regular member is probably the better line to be looking at. So why do men remain overrepresented? Well, I'm sure many of you can think of ideas. So here's a recent paper that just came out. Hostile climates are a barrier to diversification. Gender differences in recommendation letters for postdoctoral fellowships in geoscience. This one was very compelling and depressing by one of our speakers, Kuheli, who's speaking later. A recent paper looking at NSF submissions by career stage across different divisions. So here in Geo, you can see that by the time it gets to full professors, women are just submitting many fewer proposals than men. And here's a quote, which I think captures some interesting things that are not reflected in these papers that I've just shared with you. And this is by a woman who wants to be anonymous. And she was going to meetings mostly in the 90s. Being made most unwelcome by other women and some men in my field and closely related paleo fields at the actual event, which is the annual meeting, in part because my degree is from the wrong place, so this sort of idea of elitism, in part because I work on coal and energy, in part because I got tired of being touched by drunks. It wouldn't happen now, although it still does. The guys in question are dead, but the yucky feeling remains. I do not know if I could be enticed back. So I think there's a lot of intersection reasons about why we have this disconnect between the ratios that we're seeing in our students and what we're seeing in our senior members. All right, gonna get into the awards. I've already described the medal and the Schukert. Fellows are members of the PS who have made significant contributions through research, teaching, or service to the profession. So this is cumulative number of awards given in the medal and the Schukert by gender over time, okay? Very dramatic looking and sort of sad. But let's dig into it a little bit more and see what we learn. So here is sort of a stacked histogram. So the fellow program was only introduced in the early 2000s, whereas the medal and the Schukert have been around longer. So you can see that the proportion of, or the number of women fellows is much higher than what we see in the medal and the Schukert award. Some people sort of see the fellows as a way to make up for the fact that women were likely overlooked for the Schukert for many decades. That's sort of an anecdotal thing. If we look at the total sort of proportion for fellows, medal, and Schukert awards for all time, this is what it looks like. But if we zoom into the last decade, this is what it looks like. So awards have become much more representative in the last 20 years. And I think this is really important to point out, okay? Especially the Schukert is now essentially at parity, which is really amazing, considering what my experience was as a graduate student sitting at that banquet table. Okay, I'm actually gonna skip this stuff because I wanna get into some more. All right, so service. So for service, I basically got archive lists of everyone who's been on a committee, who's been president, who's been chair of some committee over the whole history of the society. And this is what we see in terms of inferred gender for women and men. So we're seeing a big increase in women doing service in the 2000s, and then an even larger increase in just the last few years. So awesome, women are doing a lot of service, love it. There's a problem, however, and the problem is that if we categorize that service, if we look at executive officers versus education and outreach, and this includes our some of our diversity and equity work, we're seeing big shifts, okay? So we're seeing that executive officers are still dominated by men, and some of our more education and outreach related service is vastly dominated by women, much more disproportionate to the low 30%, maybe or high 30% proportion of women in our entire discipline. So women are doing a lot of service, which isn't necessarily a bad thing, but if that service has sort of a gender component to it, I think that's something that we really need to be conscious and aware of. And you'll note that publications are almost as bad as executive officers in terms of the gender of those who are involved, okay? And of course, publications are a critical thing for folks' careers. All right, so next steps and a call to action. So I guess my conclusion from this are that straight, cisgendered, able-bodied white women are doing okay in the Paleo Society. I want to make it very clear that this does not negate the harm from decades of sexism and exclusion of women in our field. And it does not mean that sexism and harassment is still not a continual issue for many women. One of the things that I got out of this analysis is that efforts relating to women should include a focus on post-student or sort of mid-career stage. And this is something that's increasingly seen across the STEM fields. 3 minutes, okay. Women are doing a vastly disproportionate amount of society service, but only in certain gendered categories. And I think that all of this tells us that we, obviously, that we need to continue to expand our diversity and inclusion efforts beyond the gender binary. Not that we're done with not that women are done or fixed or whatever, but that we need to expand our conversations and our discussion and our efforts. So what comes next? Okay, so here's just a couple of quotes that I think embody some of the things that I've been thinking about. So here's a quote from Mickey Kendall's really wonderful book, Hood Feminism. Mainstream white feminists, which I would consider myself one of, will have to confront the racism of white women and the harm it does without passing the buck to white men. So I guess the point here is that white women, we need to acknowledge the role that we've played, as opposed to just putting the blame on the white men in our field. And then the last quote here, you can read this Twitter one, is this one by Sarah Ahmed, who's a Black feminist scholar. And she's talking about race and institutions. I think the final comment, there are issues of perception among certain communities which are stopping them from reaching us. So you could imagine us being paleontology is particularly suggestive. The certain communities is an implicit reference to communities of color. Race often appears under the euphemism of community, an appearance that is a disappearance. The implication that the institution does not reach such communities, so you can say the paleontology does not reach such communities, it does not include them because they perceive the institution as excluding them. The problem of whiteness is thus redescribed here, not as an institutional problem, but as a problem with those who are not included by it. So we have to take responsibility for what our society looks like, as opposed to passing the buck onto communities that we may perceive as not being interested in us. So just quickly, I want to say what the Paleo Society is already doing, because we're already doing a ton. We have a really, really strong ethics code. I'd say one of the strongest of any society, and I really encourage you to learn about it and take advantage of it. There is no statute of limitations for this code. We also have an incredible diversity and inclusion committee headed by Dina Smith. And this is just a screenshot of the anti-racism statement that the Paleo Society put out. It's on our website, and I definitely recommend that you read it and check out the resources that they posted. Right now, applications are open for the PS conference travel grants that support inclusion for those of you who are interested in registering for GSA but might not have the financial ability to do that. So what's next? White men need to step up re-service, especially in education and outreach. We need an acknowledgement of how white men in our field have benefited from a legacy of sexism, and we need an acknowledgement of how white men and women in our field have benefited from white supremacy. Continued work on ethics reporting and support for victims, supporting the work of the DEI committee. We have a climate survey that we did in fall 2019, and we'll be sharing the results of that moving forward to learn more about the experiences of different groups. Nominate white women and people of color for awards, and do your homework and listen. And I also want to give a plug to this really wonderful GSA Party Symposium on strategies for excellence in diversity and inclusion. And I encourage you to participate in the workshop that afternoon and listen to the talks. And that's part of GSA, and you can learn more about that here. I can put a link in too. And I just want to end with this slide and to just point out that when I was sitting there watching this parade of not women going up on stage, I spent very little time thinking about the fact that almost everybody who went up on that stage was white. And that is my fault, my problem. And I think that it's, for many white people, it is our problem. I think those of us who have been complicit, even if only in our silence, have to begin or continue the work of becoming truly anti-racist. And again, if you need a place to start, I definitely recommend the Paleo Society's D&I committee document, which you can find on their website. Okay, thank you.
Thank you so much, Phoebe. We have time for one, maybe two questions.
Sorry.
All right. No, it was great. I'm so glad. All right, so first up, what actions can be taken to improve the culture of PS and other academic areas for increased equity between the genders?
Oh, wow. So many things. So one of the things, there's a whole PS banquet committee that's working. Obviously, we're not having a banquet this year, but for the banquet next year, thinking about, okay, how can we maybe change the alcohol situation at the PS banquet so that it's less boozy? How can we maybe highlight, one of the things I think would be great would be sort of to highlight and acknowledge some of the women who were potentially overlooked for awards in the 80s and 90s, for example. I think that would be really powerful. So thinking about sort of like restorative things that the society could do. The previous talk where we learned about, from Phil's talk, learning about, you know, talking about these issues with your students, right? Like you can't just bring your students to GSA and pretend everything is going to be hunky-dory. Being honest with your students about what they might experience and supporting them, making sure that they're aware of the resources that are available, educating yourself on what might happen if you are, you know, not a woman and you are bringing women students or underrepresented students to a meeting, making sure that you're providing them with the proper structures and support, I think is really critical. And also encouraging more community. I think this symposium itself is really great, a great way to do that.
Okay, I have one more. Someone asked, what are your thoughts about the leaky pipeline theory? Do you feel women's roles are a major factor in not continuing into faculty roles and maybe choosing an alternate career path?
Yeah, so I specifically did not include the leaky pipeline term in my talk because I think it's super problematic, because it implies that there's something wrong with women who leave. And I almost left academia, and so I have sort of like a personal feeling about that as well. Not everybody needs to go on to become an academic. It's not realistic given our job market, and it is not necessarily the path forward for everybody. The question is whether or not people are making that decision because of negative issues that they are facing because of their gender. It's not that, you know, leaving academia is a bad thing. It's a bad thing if people are doing it because they're not being properly supported, not being properly mentored, they are not, they don't have accessible childcare, things like that. So I think that's what we should be focusing on. If people should leave for whatever reason is best for them, but if it has to do with their race, their ethnicity, their gender, their disability, any factor like that, then it's a problem.
Thank you. All right, so that concludes your Q&A. If you have more questions for Phoebe, please just go ahead and throw them in the Q&A, and we can bring them up again at the finish of this particular session. All right, panelists, I'm going to begin reading some questions for you guys. All right, someone asked, are there specific systemic changes in an academic or non-academic setting that you have identified for us to advocate to increase diversity or inclusion and equity?
Specific systemic changes.
I mean, getting rid of the GRE, a lot of people are doing that right now. That's a, you know, it's kind of trendy right now, but I think for good reasons. And it's something that I think has benefited from communities, institutions coming together and pushing for it. COVID crisis has obviously made that easier, but hopefully it'll last.
Yeah, I'll totally co-sign on that. I've spent a lot of time talking and thinking about why it is that people turn to the GRE as this sort of lightning rod for change. And my general take on it is that it is something that it represents so much more in the heads of faculty members often than even those who make the test say. And so by engaging a conversation about the GRE, you're sort of taking on some of the most high barriers to equity. You're taking on how do people conceptualize intelligence, quality, merit, excellence. The challenging part with that is that if you're only talking about the GRE and then not thinking also about how other aspects of admissions can reinforce the same stereotypes, whether it's through letters of recommendation, that the profile of the student becomes biased, or trends within personal statements that privilege certain kinds of research experiences that not everybody has access to. Yeah, it is a great example of it's a specific change that you can seek, and that if you do it in a systemic way, if you position the change of the GRE within a broader conversation about what's the culture that we tend to value, how is admissions a place that we tend to value culture of certain sorts and not others, it's helping to surface some of the things that have been latent in there all along, but that we don't always take time to make explicit.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. It's like the tip of an iceberg of conversations about, you know, elite institutions and, right, I mean, there's so many coded words that we use that end up leading to overrepresentation of some groups. And so, you know, that can, if you're looking for a place to start, I think that can be a good starting place that can hopefully lead to bigger conversations like Julie was talking about.
I'll just also mention quickly though that if you're looking for part of the rationale, especially given the summer's racial uprisings for colleagues who are still resisting making a change to the GRE, you could, one pitch that's increasingly effective is to say, hey, if you're not willing to change this one thing about one part of our system, what should give us as students or as colleagues who want to be change agents confidence that the department or disciplinary leadership is serious about making systemic change? Because really there's a lot more going on than just this one thing. And this is a moment in which, like you said, Phoebe, if we're not willing to make that change now, and if we're not willing to make that one little change, what should give us confidence that the leadership is serious about making systemic change?
Yeah, I agree, and I'll you know, right, because you could argue that any sort of standardized test could be a barrier, not just GRE but SAT or ACT. You know, one change that I was really proud to you know, impart was we had training for our incoming teaching assistants, and we added a module to this was at University of Arizona College of Science. We added a module for diversity. You know, just to, you know, make sure that our new teaching assistants were aware of biases and how they, you know, understood how they could be inclusive of everyone in their classroom. It was low-hanging fruit, but I think very effective. All
right, I'm going to go on to the next question. Someone has asked, how do you see bridging field or other experiences for A, those who were attracted to field geology precisely because of the informality, constant togetherness, and personal challenges of toughness, with B, those who need and want more boundaries in those areas?
I'll say just a few words about that, but I'm confident that Phil and Phoebe would have awesome things to say too. I think the main thing is just to recognize that that norms and values are always like can be thought of as a double-edged sword. Depending on how they're defined and deployed in real life, they can be really, really positive tools for a broad number of people, or they can be highly exclusionary. And so that idea of redefining toughness, not to exclude physical toughness, but to say that that's not the only kind of strength that has value. And that if we're willing to accept that within the field, those who have been successful are not they're not a narrow profile. And more, instead of defining it based on how it has been through history, through the present, the eyes of the present, and who's being successful and why. That way you have an opportunity to, like, you can imagine something like the boundaries have been here, and it's not like we're trying to eliminate from that the field people who fit within that, but really to like just be more expansive, to be more capacious, and to recognize that in the 21st century and in the society that we have, there's more that can be successful about it.
Yeah, totally agree. I think, you know, one thing that we've worked hard at doing at my own institution is just thinking about the imaging that we're, or the you know, the visuals or the concepts that we're sharing with our students, especially introductory courses, to acknowledge the fact that fieldwork is a component of what we do, but there are many other components, right? There's lab work, there's data analysis, you know, we're starting to teach our students, you know, R a lot earlier, things like that. So again, like Julie said, you know, we're not saying that fieldwork doesn't exist or isn't important, and we acknowledge that many of our students do start taking our courses because they like being outside, but expanding that picture, okay, to make sure that, you know, just even the images that are up in our hallways aren't all of, you know, our white male students on a big mountain in Montana, right? Not that there's anything wrong with that or their enjoyment of that experience, and we want to make sure that people who do want to have those experiences can have them, but that's not the norm or the default for our earth sciences community, I think is really important. And then of course the conversations about accessibility in field trips, which we heard about this morning, also super important. Making sure that people have access to different kinds of field experiences that they feel comfortable with, and making sure that when you talk about those things, it's not like you know, this is the B trip, right? That you're not putting judgment on the different experiences that students are going to have.
Mm-hmm. I love the slide that that Cameron had of the historical profile and then the reality of diversity within paleontology. So probably could have like included that one somewhere on the right to say that it's like, yes, it's all of that. It's where we've been and where we're going.
Going off on that, where field camp is often a big requirement for many programs, especially at the graduate level, what advice do you have for getting around that field camp requirement, or how can we be more inclusive in our field in general when it comes to work?
I mean, we just shouldn't have field requirements. We don't have one. I didn't have one when I was an undergrad. I turned out okay. I've done a lot of field work. I mean, I know this is a controversial topic, so I'm, you know, but I don't think that there needs to be a field requirement.
Was there another,
feel very differently.
Did you have a capstone or other, because I think in some places at least the argument for it is that this is the place where your learning comes together. But I can imagine as an education professor that there's lots of ways to make your learning come together.
Yeah, we have like synthetic senior seminars where students are integrating different kinds of knowledge and, you know, doing higher order thinking, and everyone has the chance to do field work and to have field experiences.
Yeah, I would say, you know, so I think, I mean, if you look at field camp as a requirement, as, you know, how it's supposed to lead students into careers, I would argue that most undergraduates don't go on to become, you know, mappers, you know, right? There's so many more career opportunities, you know. However, I do see a value in having a capstone course that really ties the curriculum together. And also it's like, you know, if you're just looking at it from the socialization point of view, it's like an incredible memory for so many majors. You know, ask them about their field camp experiences, you know, and it's, you know, I'd argue that it's a good reinforcer of an identity as a geoscientist. So altogether eliminating, you know, field courses, you know, I would not be in favor of that, but I'm also really disappointed whenever I hear, you know, someone say, well, if student, you know, so-and-so can't hack field camp, you know, then they can't become, you know, a geologist. Like, you know, there needs to be that workaround for, you know, students that with mobility impairments, or even a student who say is interested in remote sensing, you know, that, you know, you don't need to be out in the field to look at satellite data. And I believe there is, again, I'll call back. So my alma mater, University of Arizona, actually offers an accessible Earth field course, which can take the place of that traditional field camp. And, you know, it's in Italy, which, you know, makes it somewhat inaccessible itself. But I don't see why, you know, other programs can't put together a similar course that maybe is lab and office based.
Thank you. All right, I'm going to ask the next question. This is from Jen. Jen asks, is there any effort to standardize codes of conduct in fieldwork? I've worked for one PI who has no code, no guide, another that had a very comprehensive guide, and it made a huge difference. Thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, I've written a code for our department and been involved in the work with the Paleo Society's, you know, sort of larger code of conduct. But I think that's an interesting, I think the, Geo Advances team has a whole website on the CERC page. If someone wants to pull up that link and pop it in, which is super, super helpful. And I am constantly sending to colleagues. And so that provides a really great set of resources, because everyone's, you know, depending on what type of fieldwork you're doing or what sort of, you know, population you're working with, obviously your code is going to need to change somewhat, but there's going to be some universal things, one would hope. But I don't know of any sort of larger recommendations. It would be interesting for someone like GSA or even the Paleo Society or AGU to look into that. I think that's an interesting idea.
Yeah, the AGU Ethics and Equity Center may have something going in that regard. I'm not entirely sure, but I'll mention that there's a certain amount of, like, the discussion about what should go in a code of conduct is good to have collaboratively, but I'm not totally persuaded that at a field-wide disciplinary level, a single code of conduct is a good idea, because context matters so much, and what is acceptable code of conduct or accessible behavior is going to vary a little bit by context, or at least the issues that are salient that people are going to really feel like need to be represented there might need to vary. In the same way that when people are putting together a syllabus or an evaluation rubric, there's usefulness in seeing templates, but then also developing your own that's locally resonant so that there's buy-in for it. I think codes of conduct are a good thing for a group to do together, as opposed to have just handed to them. And so any sort of effort to create a standardized one could probably be more like a starting point for conversation than the bar to which everybody should be rising.
I think that's a super important point. And like having, also when you have one, talking about not just handing it out and walking away, like it has to be a conversation with your students, with people you're going into a field, and something I'm still working on myself because it can be kind of awkward and uncomfortable. But I think that, Julie's point that it is a community coming together in some ways and deciding that this is how they are going to behave, and that these are the the norms that they are going to adhere to. And so having that community buy-in, I think, is really essential. It can't just be a piece of paper.
I literally had this terrible experience once at a conference where a colleague of mine came to me and said, "Oh my goodness, X person just yelled at me," and went on for quite a while about how they had like violated the code of conduct. And then 10 minutes later, that same individual who had done the yelling went up on the stage and presented the code of conduct for the 100-some people who were attending the conference. So like a mission statement, or like all things, we have to remember that these are tools. Like anything else, they can be adhered to or not. And it's how we use the tools, not their existence, that helps to change behavior.
Julie, I have a question for you. Have you ever run into a situation where a person in a field experience was maybe a bad actor or had some bad behavior, but because there wasn't a code of conduct, they were okay with, the university was okay with that?
I know I've heard about that at the Field Institute that we held, and the closest that I can describe to seeing something that fit that was there was this kind of story that was going around at one of the courses that I observed, where an international student smacked the butt of a woman student in the class, and the instructor felt like they should mention it to the students that it wasn't acceptable to do that, but because they were an international student and the norms might be different in their country, that they were not necessarily going to take any further action. So I think it's one of those situations where, yeah, we're in a conversation about norms and rules that are socially constructed, and how we manage them and enforce them is also going to be socially constructed. I don't know if that's quite answering your question, but yeah, it happens all the time.
Yeah, no, that's sort of my experience, is that, and it seems like every year, so I was a staff member on a field camp, and every year it's like you get a lot of people together, and there's always someone who's just like not quite used to, working in a group environment for weeks at a time. And as a result of something, you end up, adding a new rule to the, the rule book, right? Right. And it's like, okay, well, we didn't think about this before, but yeah, I guess we have to address it. I think that sort of code of conduct needs to be a living document.
That's right.
And as you mentioned, socially constructed, if you're in any sort of leadership position, it may not be in your job description, but I would encourage you to, do just this, right? Is to take an active role in identifying the behaviors that you like and that you don't like in field experiences, and putting it out there.
I think that this ties in with an earlier question about like with concrete things that people can do, and encouraging your department or your program to, you know, develop a code of conduct and have that conversation in addition to the GRE thing would be a great idea.
Yeah, that's actually a great idea. Yeah.
And to have, you know, to revisit it too. I know with my classes, when we have discussion guidelines, which is sort of the equivalent for a code of conduct, we don't just do it on the first day and then file it away. We check in about once a month, or if I know we're going to be having a discussion about a paper that is like really hot in some way, we check in with our norms before we have that discussion. So yeah, that gives it a chance to be that living document, like you're saying, Phil.
All right, so next question. What do you recommend for a female faculty who are trying to be role models for their female and underrepresented students when the female faculty is faced by such social behaviors of sexism and discrimination, not only in the fields, but maybe in a professional setting or elsewhere?
Super hard. I mean, I would say be kind to yourself, because if you're in that situation, like, you're taking on a lot of like pain probably. And so, and it can be really hard because you want to be there for your students. I've never been in quite that extreme of a situation, but I have found that having honest conversations with my students about experiences that I've had, even if it's, I'm just sort of giving them summaries and not, you know, you don't want to overshare with your students, can be really helpful and can lead to a conversation where they feel like they have, you know, have a realistic picture, but where you can obviously, you know, as the adult in the situation, be like, look, if any of this happens to you, you know, that you are there to support them, and that even if they see something negative happening to you as the instructor, that does not mean it's okay. Yeah.
I'd add to that too, that to the extent that your conditions allow you to not try to handle it alone, whether it's connecting with other female colleagues or men who are supportive, or people who are outside the gender binary who really get the dynamics of navigating gender and what sexism look like on a day-to-day basis. Having people, not your students, again, to open up to about that is both good in terms of devising strategies, but also developing more of a network of support. So in theories of motivation, being connected and being a sense of belonging to whatever group you're trying to be motivated within is a really key pillar of motivation. And so anytime you're trying to navigate difficult situations on your own, it's going to be more difficult. And then the other thing, over time, I hope your institutions have ombudspersons available. And if they don't, that's another really concrete thing that you can advocate for in your organization or your department, because that's a great outlet in situations where you're trying to be a good role model, but you might not feel like you have very many outlets for discussing the realities that you're experiencing Ombudspersons are really critical as like a low bar reporting mechanism that help to keep track of issues as they come up without necessarily escalating them to a Title IX investigation immediately. So that's a major finding of my research, is just creating more opportunities for talking about it, that deinstitutionalizing silence as the state of affairs when sexism occurs in both the little things and in the bigger things that are made possible because we have stopped paying attention to the seriousness of the little things.
Yeah, you know, it's obvious I haven't experienced it in the same sense of female colleagues, but I have witnessed, you know, some pretty we'll say archaic viewpoints that were pushed very strongly by certain faculty. You know, and my thought is, you know, you got to support, you know, the women who've, you know, experienced this type of discrimination, and also encourage them to document it. You know, there are some cases where universities are not receptive, right, where you can't find a mediator or an advocate, you know, and it does eventually get to like the legal arena. You know, and my thought is, you know, if you have everything well documented, that only helps your case.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you. I'm going to read the next question. Marina asks, what incentives can Paleo Society and other societies do to promote people to get involved in outreach and education services? How can we reward the great work people like you, Cameron, all of, you know, so many people are doing, and then make it more rewarding?
That's a tough question. I mean, I know through anecdotal discussions with leaders in sort of the education side of Paleo Society that they will often email many, many people to ask them to be on the education and outreach committee, and that men are more likely to say no, which I'm sure is not a surprise to anyone. So I think that's part of the the reason for some of the data that I showed. This is way bigger than the Paleo Society or paleontology or earth science, right? So we're getting into big societal gendered issues here. And so I don't think I have a good answer. I think raising awareness to the society and having it, go all the way up to the level of the executive committee is really important. So that people feel like this is a priority for the entire society, not just for the one person who's trying to convince you to be on this committee.
Yeah, I guess I'll jump in here. So, right, there's like kind of like two types of people. There's those who are motivated intrinsically, to teach and do outreach. And there's those who are motivated extrinsically. If you're intrinsic, then you're just probably going to do it because you enjoy it. If you're an extrinsic person, then you want some sort of payoff, whether it be money or recognition or whatever. I do think that like the 10-year evaluation process should acknowledge community engagement more than it does. If it does, and it arguably varies from institution to institution, and I've always looked at it as a very broad issue because diversity is important in science, but also like the taxpayers are funding National Science Foundation, National Institutes for Health, these granting agencies. And so you really want to be able to show off what you're doing, right? And not, silo yourself in your studies. So that's kind of, for me, like the approach. It's like, look, if you do these things, if you connect with the community, it's going to pay off, politically for the university down the road. So there should be an incentive there to, for faculty and for students to get out in the community and share what they're doing.
All right, it looks like we have time for one final question for you all. So since many of our majors in paleontology and geosciences are recruited from taking introductory classes, how can we change the culture of these classes to better recruit more diverse students in the field?
I'm in the middle of developing a new introductory class, like right now. So I've been thinking about this a lot. So again, going back to the what are you showing, what are you representing? So making sure that if you're talking about careers in whatever discipline you're talking about, that it's not just, the macho field part of the discipline, but that you're talking about people who do all kinds of different work. Showing diversity of different types of scientists and science continually through your lectures. If you're reading scientific papers, making sure that you're reading papers from a diverse group of scientists. And again, diversity can mean, many, many different things, right? We're not just necessarily talking about racial diversity. So making sure that you're thinking sort of intersectionally about the types of scientists and science that you're showing. Changing the way you teach. So active learning, using ungrading techniques. The CERC website is an amazing resource for learning about these kinds of pedagogies if there are things that you're not familiar with, but there's really good data to suggest that does influence the experience of underrepresented students in the classroom. Reaching out to students if you have research opportunities, as opposed to waiting for students to come to you. Making sure that you learn your students' names and can pronounce them correctly, and that you don't misgender students. I'm doing a laundry list now, but those are just some of the things that jump to my head. There's actually a really wonderful paper, I can link to it in the comments, that's like 21 techniques for building an inclusive classroom that I've used a bunch, so I can share that with folks.
Thank you so much, Phoebe.
I think
All right.
Oh,
please do.
I was just going to maybe provide a little synthetic comment for what Phoebe had to say, is that what you're describing there is a huge body of activity. And when you start to recognize or encourage your colleagues to recognize that teaching is a practice that has a whole lot of knowledge and evidence behind it, in the same way that paleontology has a body of evidence behind it scientifically, you start to realize that the knowledge and skills that it takes to do instruction are not just to be absorbed or picked up or born with, but rather to be honed and developed in the same way that expertise in other fields are. And so embedding that process of learning about teaching, or learning about curriculum design, or learning about how to just do our work better academically within this realm of efforts around diversity, equity, and inclusion, that like using the literature and recognizing it as a domain of knowledge that needs to be cultivated over time, the way any kind of expertise does, goes a long way.
I think Phoebe really sort of nailed all the major ideas. You know, it's right, and as Julie added, you know, like you know, it's up to the instructors to want to improve how they teach. You know, and I think there's some instructors who are content with their status quo, but there's many who are always willing to improve, and having that human connection where, you know, you can highlight a scientist of color in your lecture, I think is huge, and you know, the more of that, you know, it's kind of like chipping it away at a big iceberg. You know, eventually we'll get there.
Yeah, I think that's, you know, Julie's point is so critical. Like, there are people who, you know, this is their job, this is what they study. So familiarizing yourself with that literature and that scholarship. And then Phil's point that, like, I just did a laundry list, right? And that can be overwhelming if you're, you know, teaching a 4-4 next year, right? But just picking one or two things that feel like that you're able to take on, and again, chipping away, and you know, that you don't have to change your course overnight if you can't. But if you're teaching a new course, right, from scratch, if you're a newly minted, you know, instructor, then that's a great opportunity to really dig into this literature.
Thank you so much. All right, this concludes session 2 of PRI Symposium. We want to thank our speakers and organizers for donating their time and effort to make this part a success. And if you haven't done so, please think about donating to one of our speakers' suggested funds found on our symposium webpage. Also, before you leave, we would appreciate it if you could fill out our feedback survey with any questions or comments that you might have. So thank you so much for joining us. We will now be taking a 1-hour break, and we will resume with session 3 promptly at 4 p.m. Eastern. So thank you, and see you soon.